Greetings, I'm Chuck Lennox. I am the coordinator of the Global Alliance for Heritage Interpretation, which is an organization of professional groups from around the world that support heritage interpretation in all its forms. I want to welcome you to our webinar series, Global Excellence in Heritage Interpretation. I trust you will enjoy these webinars from our various member groups and from other speakers around the world. I think you'll gain a new perspective on heritage interpretation. Let's introduce our member groups. Thanks for coming.
Hello, I'm Beth Moravon, Chair of the Association for Heritage Interpretation, the UK membership organisation for natural and cultural heritage interpreters. I'm delighted to be part of the Global Alliance for Heritage Interpretation Steering Committee and welcome you to our webinar series, Global Excellence in Heritage Interpretation.
Hello, bonjour, my name is Sarah Rao and I am the Vice Chair for Interpretation Canada. We are a community that recognizes, celebrates, debates, and inspires heritage interpretation in Canada, and we are thrilled to be taking part in the GAHI webinar series. We hope you enjoy.
Hi, I'm Kylie Christian, President of Interpretation Australia, and I'm really glad to welcome you to the Global Alliance for Heritage Interpretation's webinar series. We love being part of it, and we hope you love it too.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to you all. My name is Nick, and I am the chair of the Interpretation Network of New Zealand. We are a network designed to bring together interpretation professionals and showcase the best practice happening around our beautiful country of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Please enjoy this webinar from our international colleagues in the Global Alliance of Heritage Interpretation. Kia ora.
Hello, I'm Helena Vicic, and I'm representing Interpret Europe, a European Association for Heritage Interpretation. We're very excited about this opportunity of sharing excellence across the world. We're digging up knowledge here in Europe that can have a potential to inspire colleagues from other continents. And vice versa, the inspiration in the Global Alliance is guaranteed to come back. Global Alliance of Heritage Interpretation with the webinar series is a treasure box of inspiration and good practice that promotes high standards of heritage interpretation globally.
Hi there, I am Paul Caputo, Executive Director for the National Association for Interpretation. We serve 6,000 heritage interpreters in the United States. We are thrilled to be one of the organizing partners of the Global Alliance for Heritage Interpretation year-long free webinar series. Enjoy!
Well, welcome. It looks like we had a little bit of a sound issue there. Can everyone hear me? If somebody could just post in the chat. Okay, great. Looks like we can. Great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. My name is Chuck Lennox with the Global Alliance for Heritage Interpretation. The previous tape kind of introduced the Global Alliance and the different member groups. But today I want to welcome you to the 7th webinar in our series, Global Excellence in Heritage Interpretation, today hosted by Interpretation Australia. Today's webinar is I Don't Know What That Is, but I Love That It's There, Rethinking the Social Values and Public Outcomes of an In Situ Archaeological Conservation and Presentation in Australia. Please put any questions you might have for the speaker in our Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll answer those questions at the end of the talk. Let me pass the screen over to my colleague, Kylie Christian from Interpretation Australia to introduce our speaker. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Chuck, and welcome everyone. As Chuck said, my name is Kylie Christian and I am President of Interpretation Australia. Before we start today's presentation, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country, which is a practice we do in Australia, like some other parts of the world, to honour and recognise the history and heritage of Australia's First Nations peoples. I would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of all the lands and nations of Australia, wherever you may be located. Today I am coming to you from the lands of the Awabakal people north of Sydney. This is the land on which I was born and raised, one where the wedge-tailed eagle, Biriban, has special significance for the Awabakal people. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and thank them for their continued support and sharing of knowledge as we journey towards reconciliation. Welcome too to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us online for this presentation. Today we are very lucky to have with us Dr. Caitlin Allen. Dr. Allen is a Sydney-based archaeologist and heritage specialist who worked for the New South Wales state government for nearly 2 decades as a heritage administrator and hands-on practitioner. More recently, she has undertaken more academic work as a seasonal lecturer in heritage and museum studies at the University of Sydney. Her current research interests focus on social values and place attachment, including the ways archaeological remains contribute to the creation of livable cities and community wellbeing. Caitlin is a member of the New South Wales Heritage Council's Approvals Committee, an expert member of the International Scientific Committee on Archaeological Heritage Management, and a former Vice President of Australia ICOMOS, as well as a member, of course, of Interpretation Australia. Please welcome Dr. Caitlin Allen.
So good morning to you all, and welcome to everyone wherever you happen to be in the world, whatever time of day or night it is for you. I really do appreciate you being here. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Gamaragal people here on the beautiful northern shores of Sydney Harbour. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the research that I'm speaking about today was undertaken on the lands of the Gadigal, Gundungurra, Tharawal and Palawa peoples of New South Wales and Tasmania, and I pay my deep respects to their elders past and present and thank them for their ongoing custodianship and care of country. So back in 1985, David Lowenthal, well-known heritage scholar, I'm sure many of you know him, suggested that heritage is not so much about conservation but creation. And understanding the creative capacities of archaeological places became a core driver of my research. So today I'd like to consider with you the ways that relationships can develop between people and archaeological places, and how understanding of those relationships can really challenge long-held professional ideas about the purpose and outcomes of both in situ archaeological conservation and interpretation, as well as the practice of archaeology itself and heritage management more broadly. So we're going to look at the social, emotional and imaginative experiences that people have with these remains of the past and the present, and the ways they build outcomes such as individual and collective identity, resilience, well-being, belonging and social cohesion. And I'm then going to conclude by considering what all of this might actually mean for the identification, management and interpretation of these places. And I should note that while the case studies that I'm discussing are all archaeological places, the findings are equally applicable to all types of heritage. So if you're joining us and you are a practitioner who doesn't work necessarily with archaeological sites, I know you'll find this research will speak to your practice as well as it has in my own work, because these days I often work more in heritage than archaeology. So I interviewed hundreds of members of the public at 5 case study sites in Australia where archaeological remains have been conserved and presented in the context of new development in order to understand people's feelings about the remains and the ways they value them, the private and public outcomes of their interactions with the past in the present. And 4 of my case studies were in everyday heritage places, a shopping centre, a youth hostel, a conservatorium of music and a university campus with a medical sciences focus. The 5th case study was the Museum of Sydney on the site of First Government House. And I focused on non-museum settings because there isn't really a lot of research that's occurred in Australia about these kinds of everyday relationships with historic places and in particular archaeological remains, with a notable exception being some earlier research done by Professor Tracy Ireland from the University of Canberra. Much of the research globally has been undertaken in the context of museums or dedicated historic sites, where you tend to access people who are predisposed to an interest in heritage, and the focus is usually on assessing how much people are actually learning about these places rather than what their experiences with them are like. So I wanted to set this research up in a different way. So when I asked people about their feelings about the conserved archaeological remains, one of the most common responses I received was along these lines. Oh, that thing in the glass box over there. Yeah, I've walked past it every day for nearly 4 years. I don't really know what it is, but I really love that it's there. Now, you might, as an interpreter or an archaeologist, assume that this interpretation was a catastrophic failure because people don't understand what they're looking at. And you might, as many of my colleagues have, when I've shared this research while it was in progress, conclude that archaeologists and interpreters just need to get better at explaining an archaeological view of the past and why it's important to the public. But in my mind, this isn't a failure. It's very interesting, and it suggests that these places are actually delivering something else. So if it's not just about learning, what is actually going on? Well, you can see some of the outcomes here on this slide, and the differences are really immediate. I should note that as well as the public, I also interviewed about 50 archaeologists and heritage practitioners to understand what they think the purpose and outcomes of in situ archaeological conservation are. And you can see the immediate differences in understanding. For the professionals that I interviewed, the work of in situ conservation, and indeed the work of archaeology as a discipline, was seen to be a very top-down process, primarily about the transmission of knowledge, about recovering information from the past, from excavations, and communicating that to the public. In fact, that was me when I started this research. I'd become so jaded as a practitioner of over 20 years at that point, having worked on many of these sorts of sites. I was convinced I was going to come out the other end of this research suggesting that in situ conservation and interpretation is difficult and expensive, that no one gets anything out of it, and it shouldn't happen again. In fact, as you can see, I found the complete opposite. The public emphasised all of these other outcomes apart from learning to do with having experiencing a livable and enjoyable environment on a daily basis, a sense of well-being, and most importantly, a sense of connection and belonging. There was also a difference in the general levels of support for the practice of in situ conservation. Perhaps surprisingly, there was fairly low support amongst archaeologists and very high, almost universal support amongst members of the public. This ranged from people who weren't really highly invested themselves, but thought the practice was really important for society, through to people who were so emotional, in a good way, that they were crying while I interviewed them, and I started to take tissues with me everywhere I went for that eventuality. I should also note that the data here, the responses from the public, are fairly universal. It didn't seem to really matter which site, the size of the display, or the demographic factors of age or cultural background. These were the sorts of responses I got across all 5 sites. And I did feel that I was seeing a fairly universal human response to this evidence of the past in the present. So I'd now like to walk you through some of the comments from the public, sharing their voices directly, because they really are at the heart of my PhD research. So the most common responses I received were to do with the contribution of the archaeology to a livable and enjoyable environment. Many people commented on the striking combinations of new and old, of other functions alongside conservation, and the ways the presence of the archaeological remains really made these sites interesting places to spend time in, and engaging places to be, places that people wanted to be in. Often these were people who hadn't engaged with the interpretive material and weren't sure what they were actually looking at. And at the shopping centre site south of Sydney, the remains of a 19th century ironworks have been kept in the car park under a supermarket. And here, while the community really loved the remains that have been retained, many of them said they really wished that the developers hadn't just flown in, a standard shopping centre design and plan, that they wished that the car parking had been put on the roof so that the shops could have been built around the archaeological remains, and they could really enhance the experience of going to the shops, and people could have even closer interaction with them than they already do. And I do apologise, there's many comments on these slides, which is quite a lot of reading for you while I'm talking, but I just wanted to show as much range of data, but I have to say this really only scratches the surface of my PhD. And at the end, I will share with you how you can access the whole thing if you're interested to know more. The other prevalent theme was a sense of well-being derived from interactions with the in situ remains. And this came up almost from the very first interview on the first site that I looked at on the first day that I was on site, and was maintained throughout all of my field work. So this was about a sense of well-being derived from interactions with the in situ remains. And to give you some examples, drawing on some of the comments here on this slide, at that shopping centre site that I just mentioned, some of the supermarket workers surprised me. They blew me away by telling me that even though they're actually provided a lunchroom at the back of the supermarket, they often take chairs to the car park to eat their lunch sitting near the remains just because they enjoy being there. And just to give you that context quickly, and I will go back to the previous slide if you're still reading, you can see the concrete area on the left. By any stretch, it's not a great place to eat lunch, but this is where the staff come. Because such is the draw of these archaeological remains, they want to be near them. There was also a mother and a daughter who I met at the same site who said they suffer from anxiety, and they come to the shops, it triggers their anxiety, and they said they very regularly, almost every time they come down and visit the archaeological remains because they find it helps to bring their nervous systems back into regulation as a sort of soothing antidote to that busy shopping centre above. And indeed, at all the case study sites, and I'll just flick back up to that previous slide for you, at all of the case study sites, people used words like comfort, security, grounded to describe their experiences of the remains. And you can see a lot of that language here on the slide. Also to note under this theme, at the Conservatorium of Music in Sydney, many of the students aged around 18 to 24 talked about archaeology providing a sense of stress relief as they were reminded of people who came before them and lives outside their narrow sphere of academic focus, and that provided them with a sense of perspective. And you can see that here also. And I should note that you can elicit quite a lot of data about the emotional impacts of people's relationships with heritage from quite short conversational interviews. And I think as professionals, we often shy away from this kind of work because it's perceived to be too difficult or time-consuming or expensive, but it really doesn't have to be. Now, the other thing that was mentioned quite often, which wasn't quite so surprising because, as perhaps the previous two themes I've discussed, because in heritage we talk about this role of heritage all the time, a form of archiving, but this was seen as providing an archive for current and future generations, and was really the only area of my data where there was a slight difference based on age demographic, with the older people I interviewed being more interested in this sense of passing things on to future generations. Probably unsurprising, as you know, you get towards the middle and end of your life, you think more about your legacy. There was also, interestingly, a sense that there isn't much evidence that's been kept from the more recent period of Australia's history. And as a precious dwindling resource, it was important to keep as much as possible. And rather than that being seen as a reason to devalue the heritage because our sort of more recent, not including our very deep Indigenous past, but our more recent couple of hundred years post European settlement, was seen to be a rarity and something that people wanted to keep. And even here in terms of archiving, you can see these kinds of expressions of emotion. People talking about here, I get a little emotional about it. It's not just, it's very important, not just for me, but for the young ones. Okay, so knowledge, although not as prevalent as archaeologists perhaps might think or want it to be, knowledge and learning was certainly identified by the public as something that was important. And I certainly met people who read all the signs and were very engaged with the narratives in the interpretation itself. But as I said, not as prevalent as archaeologists perhaps might want it to be, certainly not the core themes like having a livable environment or a sense of well-being. But if education is something you're interested in as an archaeologist or interpreter, I do think that the presence of in situ archaeology can have a very powerful effect on people's interest to question and their ability to recall what they've learnt. It provides opportunities to tell bigger stories about society beyond the sort of didactic interpretations of, I found a wall and it's made of brick. And once people are hooked in and paying attention in this emotional state, archaeological sites, I think, can be vehicles for strong messages and to promote societal change now and in the future. This next theme, a sense of tradition, was one of the outliers. It was really prevalent at the Conservatorium of Music and to a lesser extent at the other medical sciences focused university campus, and not really so much at the other sites, but very interesting nevertheless. And this was that the remains of the past provide a sense of continuity and tradition to these institutions and a sense of identity to the students, even though the remains themselves predate the arrival of these institutions on each site. Nevertheless, they've really been adopted by both staff, I have to say, and students as part of the identity of these places. Excuse me. Now, I think what is underlying all of these outcomes is the power of in situ archaeological remains, and I would suggest heritage places in general, to support people's deep needs for connection to past individuals, families, communities, and even the spirit of the place itself. These connections are felt as being very much alive in the present, feeding into a sense of belonging and identity. And people felt able to connect through their imaginations and go on a time-traveling journey to the past because the remains were in their original location. And therefore, they were also able to reflect on themselves and their own lives in the present in that process. And you can see here on this slide a lot of words around imagining and around human connection. Now, something I was really interested in was the in situ-ness of the remains, and this is certainly a word that I made up for the purposes of this research. But I asked each person what they thought the in situ archaeological remains did for them that might be different from, say, an artefact display, a signage, or a publication, or either on or off site. And you can see the responses here. The remains being in situ made more sense and added more value to both the place and the archaeology itself. And it allowed people, as I said, to go on this journey of imagination and time travel in the place where history happened, and thus forge these direct and meaningful connections. And now, interestingly, many people also told me they don't visit museums, and they felt that the remains of the past in these everyday places meant that they and others like them could access them and experience them when they otherwise wouldn't do. And there was a sense of not having the past locked away in a site that you might have to pay to enter, or that was just removed out of context from the place where the remains happened. Now, these responses really got me thinking about the mechanics of what actually happens when people and archaeological places come together, and how these relationships work to create the sorts of outcomes that we've been discussing. So I came up with this proposed model, and I think it's very relevant to all heritage places where people move through these sorts of stages from an authentic experience of place, combining the physical, social, and emotional aspects of place, which set in motion a series of processes of building connection, a sense of belonging and place attachments, and then lead to outcomes such as the production of identity and well-being. And while this diagram is linear in arrangement, I think in reality these processes are far more complex, and that people move in and out of these stages in a far more entangled way, circling and recircling back through the stages over and over again. So now I'd like again quickly to walk you through how I see this model working. But before I do, I think it's good to put on the table my understanding of the relationships between people and things, and the materiality of heritage in the present. Because I think there's a current trend in both heritage scholarship and heritage management to talk about people-centred heritage management. And I've noticed recently on the websites of a number of Australian heritage consultants that they brand themselves that they're doing people-centred heritage management. Now, I'm the first person to say that people need to be far more centred in heritage conservation, and I do understand the desire to push back against the wholly fabric-centred approaches that we've been working with for a very long time. But I think to veer too far to the other end of the scale is also quite problematic. I think it can be useful in understanding how these relationships between people and things work to conceptualise place in a slightly different way than thinking about it only as a physical entity, which is certainly the way we do predominantly think about place in Australian heritage management. So instead, to consider it to be a container for both the physical and for the meanings, memories, practice, values, and emotions that people experience and build in these locations. So in this way, people, places, and things work together to create heritage and heritage values in the present. This approach really rejects the common separation of place as spatiality and people as sociality in Australian heritage practice in favour of a more entangled and complex relationship. And I note Steve Brown, an Australian heritage practitioner, has written quite a lot around this particular issue. In this way, like many things that are inherited from the past and used in the present, in situ archaeological remains are then capable of being vessels for memory and connections to the past, as well as a catalyst for new associations and meanings in the present and the future. And these new associations and meanings, I think, are really important to allow space for. So part of the experience of place that appears to be important as an underlying foundation to the process of connection is the perception that the remains of the past are both physically authentic and can reveal a truer, unadulterated version of the past history in a book, or even a place that has been so heavily changed and renovated, it is no longer able to represent that sort of patina of age. And in this sense, the remains possess the quality of being authentic, truthful, or genuine, as suggested by Sian Jones. And a traditional view of authenticity in a heritage context tends to focus on objective measures of material fixity, or how original the fabric of the place is. And in situ archaeological remains certainly can fulfill the conditions of this type of authenticity. And it was identified as important to many visitors who wanted to see the real thing with their own eyes. But contemporary concepts of authenticity also consider a much more dynamic, performative, and contingent process, one in which perceptions about the authenticity of an experience that you are having in a particular moment is very important. This negotiation of authenticity based on collective experience and entanglement of people and places is certainly evident in the visitor interviews that I undertook. And I think it's why new design in old contexts needs to be so carefully considered, because new design and changes to heritage places really have the capacity to either support or disrupt these processes. Adding elements being given permission to explore these places in a way that's meaningful to individuals, as opposed to a way that's just meaningful for an archaeologist or an interpreter, allows people to experience the past informed by their own sense of themselves as creative individuals. And Australian heritage practitioner Stephen Gapps has suggested that engagement which goes beyond an external visual authenticity and is deeply bound to how history might feel is very important. And he observed this in some fantastic work he did a number of years ago around the practice of reenacting historic events. He went on to say, and I quote, "The past comes to appear more accessible and verified by experiencing the production and feel of these created moments." And again, I certainly observed that in people's responses to the 5 case study sites. The importance of the in situ remains in relationship with people, giving rise to play, imagination, and emotion became very obvious, and that process didn't rely on absorbing the archaeological or historical information from the accompanying material. The interpretive material. In fact, in some cases, overly didactic interpretation appeared to be the enemy of imaginative site experiences. We tend to talk about imaginative play being really important for children, but it seems equally important for adults. And the more space there was for imaginative engagement, rather than just following an authoritative script, potentially the more malleable the place was in terms of fulfilling wellbeing needs. Public freedom of interpretation at archaeological places was of great concern to many archaeologists that I interviewed, and in some ways I found it difficult to reconcile that much archaeological interpretation seeks to remove the mystery of exploring the past by seeking to convey archaeological truths. Given the excitement of exploration, discovery and imagining seems to be what attracts many archaeologists to their profession in the first place. And in fact, when I asked them about their own personal experiences of these types of places, they too talked in emotional terms about the power of place. But with their professional hats on, they felt the need to revert to a more constrained way of thinking about their work and about heritage conservation. On the other hand, archaeological criticisms of imaginative interactions with archaeological places are perhaps not surprising when considering the emphasis on research value and scientific objectivity in archaeology and in the way that archaeologists are trained. And Light and Watson do point out, however, that for many people, it is the mystery of ruins that's appealing, for here is an opportunity for imagination to fill in the gaps. Such imaginative experiences, they suggest, are constituted in situ, relying on the open-ended encounter offered by the material remains and the interplay between what we know, what we feel, what we expect, and what we encounter. And when I interviewed Australian architect Richard Johnson, who designed the Museum of Sydney and has done many other things also, he felt very strongly that it is important to keep this historic layering in our environments, including archaeological remains, not only to make them interesting places to be, but to allow the public to create and recreate their meanings over time. And this freedom of interpretation, I think, was beautifully captured by this comment from an overseas visitor that I interviewed at the Museum of Sydney. And he said, and I'll read it from the screen, "If the object stays here, it's bound to different discourses, different interpretations of what it is. It gives us the chance for me it gives us the chance for me, for instance, to hang out with a person who thinks this is the beginning of civilization and tell me about it. Whereas if I come here with an Aboriginal person, they will tell me this is the beginning of destruction. The public access to this object and the fact that it's out there freely allows us to listen to different discourses." Now, perceptions of authenticity and the interplay of archaeological remains with human imagination are important because they appear to support a range of emotional responses in visitors to the 5 case study sites that in turn then underpin some of the core outcomes such as wellbeing and enjoyment of place. The in situ remains allowed the public access to the materiality of the past in a way that was perceived to be direct and authentic, and which sparked connection and emotion. Such responses were generally positive feelings of awe, respect, enjoyment, comfort, security, belonging, empathy, and well-being. And people often smiled as they entered the world of their imagination, thinking, for example, about locals living here on Carahurst Lane in the Rocks, at the site you see on the screen, gathering to put their Sunday roasts in the baker's oven to save on fuel. But there were also difficult emotions such as sadness or anger associated with historic events, or experiences such as death, colonisation, or simply the harshness of life. And the impacts of colonisation on our First Nations people was front of mind with many people I interviewed, despite the fact that the interpretive material on these sites doesn't generally directly address that, except at the Museum of Sydney. But nevertheless, having remains from those early colonial periods in front of people made them go on that journey in their head to imagine the very difficult and often tragic experiences of First Nations people during that early colonial period, because of course heritage can challenge as well as soothe. Now, these sorts of emotional and playful imaginative experiences are very human responses that are not often discussed explicitly in formalised archaeological or heritage management frameworks, and something that critical heritage scholar Jeremy Wells sees as problematic, and I have to agree with him. And you can see this quote from him on the slide: "Physical perceptions, experiences and feelings increasingly appear to be fundamental as to why people value historic places." Nevertheless, heritage management practice seems to numb itself to human emotion and the feelings engendered by the historic environment, as well as the promise it holds to create something in the present and for the future. This disjunct between rational heritage process and the experience of the public is prevalent not only in processes of archaeological conservation, but in heritage management more generally, and is, I think, a significant challenge for our industry that we will need to deal with sooner rather than later. The experience of in situ archaeological places through entanglements of materiality, perceptions of authenticity, imagination and emotion create and support connections and attachments between people and place that really deepen over time with repeated experiences. Place attachment is a concept from environmental psychology that's been receiving increasing attention in critical heritage studies, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it already. It is underpinned by an understanding that people create attachments through emotional experience, as you can see in the views of various writers and public figures on this slide. And I could certainly again see these processes at work. At the Highlands Marketplace in Mittagong, for example, which is where the industrial remains are in the car park under the shopping centre, much of the interpretation signage is focused on the technical aspects of the ironworks operation. But the visitors that I interviewed largely wanted to talk about the people who shaped the community around the ironworks and how challenging their lives must have been. Or they wanted to talk about the stories in the community, about the ghostly presence of a little girl called Arabella, who throws bananas at the security guards in the supermarket at 3 a.m. and moves the bags around in the luggage store. And although I couldn't find any evidence that is rooted in reality, it's a story that's become part of the mythology of the site and part of people's connection to that place that's important to them. And where people were interested in wider historical narratives, such as the role of the ironworks in the industrial development of Australia, they were considered and understood through the personal and emotional dimensions of that place. And as I've mentioned before a number of times, these engagements were possible despite people not engaging deeply with the interpretive materials, or in fact, even reading the signage at all. And Australian academic Dennis Byrne has drawn similar conclusions in work that he is doing in Western Sydney with migrant populations, particularly around Parramatta. And he found that these populations, these migrants, are engaging deeply with historic buildings in their neighbourhoods, but without necessarily understanding much about the authorised historical narratives and the listed heritage values of those places. Nevertheless, they're engaging with them in a different way that is very meaningful to them. And there's a lot of synergy there between my work and Dennis's in that respect. This then leads us to the matter of well-being, which, as I've said, was such a predominant response from people when I interviewed them. Jeremy Wells, who I previously quoted, has suggested that embodied emotional human experiences of the world facilitate or impair overall quality of life. And many of these experiences occur in a localised, ordinary, daily sense and are fundamental in structuring how people tackle, and I'm quoting now, the small and usually trivial problems of everyday life. The importance of these feelings of belonging, attachment, identity, safety, and connection, therefore, shouldn't be underestimated. And in this hierarchy of needs developed by American psychologist Abraham Maslow in 1943, he places belonging as the core psychological need just above the basic survival needs of safety, food, water, and rest. And I think archaeological remains and heritage places, which are perceived to provide these authentic links to the past, are well placed to meet people's longing for connection. But a sense of cultural depth can also provide a buffer against times of extraordinary change or upheaval, not just in that sort of everyday sense. And in a very interesting study of why people chose heritage places to explore and reconnect after the COVID lockdowns in the UK, this study found that being part of a community and returning to valued places were important to restore a sense of security, well-being, and a sense of returning to normality. Visiting a special place was also seen to provide a suitable backdrop to the momentous activity of reconnecting in person after many months and sometimes years apart. And the experience also acted as an antidote for many individuals to the stresses of lockdown and the uncertainty of dealing with the threat of the pandemic itself. And then just to conclude on this subject of well-being, building partly on Maslow's hierarchy of needs that highlight belonging as the core psychological need, Australian researcher Dan Pronk has developed this resilience model. And I think heritage and people's experience of it can contribute directly to building the innate resilience layer around beliefs and values and the mindset and social layers around relationships and identity. And other research into trauma and chronic stress responses has also demonstrated the importance of a sense of security in bringing the nervous system back into regulation. And we saw that really clearly with that mother and daughter at the Mittagong site who went to visit the archaeological remains in order to bring their nervous systems back into regulation. And also just to note, in a program my husband's running here in Australia called Operation Digger, he works with military veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and other trauma impacts of their service by involving them with archaeological and heritage projects. And he's found that the veterans benefit greatly, not only from the social and skills-based activities of participating in the projects themselves, but just from spending time in historic places, which support, as the people at the archaeological sites have reported, these feelings of belonging and security and helping to build connections and therefore all these wellbeing outcomes. And I've seen that myself with them when I've been on site, just as he has. So retaining the archaeological remains in situ and providing public access to them, therefore, becomes an essential output of archaeological work that is equally, I think, if not more important than the weighty tome of archaeological recording or professional publication, which can often just be archaeology for archaeologists. And I think it's in the experience of archaeology as place, not simply archaeology as a resource, that the substantial public outcomes of archaeology as a practice appear to be delivered. And I'm certainly not suggesting that we should do away with research and education, simply that archaeology and heritage are about so much more than just learning about the past. Now, just in conclusion, I wanted to think around with you what the implications might be of all of this for practice, the way heritage and archaeological places more broadly are managed and interpreted. First, of course, I think there needs to be this shift in thinking, particularly in relation to archaeological sites, from an interpretation approach that's driven by a rationale of educating the public to one that also accepts and supports a far broader range of experiences and outcomes and understands that heritage does real work in communities and seeks to support that. An important underpinning to this is to actually ask rather than assume. And in Australia, while the system is far from perfect, it's generally accepted that First Nations communities need to lead in the identification and management of their own cultural heritage. Yet by and large, this is not a framework extended to other communities. And while social value has been embedded in guiding Australian heritage doctrine for decades, it's rarely done in practice by actually involving communities in the assessments and mapping of those values. Which is problematic because it's clear that professional understandings of the way communities actually value heritage and the work that it does for them can be limited. Current criteria, I think, in Australia here are also too narrowly focused on specific groups of interest and don't address the work of heritage for individuals and communities more broadly. An evidence-based understanding is also, I think, important in developing both interpretive approaches and management frameworks. This type of understanding challenges the often prevalent attitude that communities don't get heritage, or at least they don't value it in the proper way and need to be educated by professionals. What I saw in my research is that people may be engaging with heritage in ways that don't line up with industry views about these proper ways to do it. But that doesn't mean they don't understand heritage or engage with it on a daily basis. If anything, I think most people do understand heritage and what it means to them personally. It just perhaps is that they don't see a place for themselves in heritage management systems, and developing frameworks that move beyond simply preventing heritage impact and look to outcomes-based decision-making that recognises the creative capacities of heritage and the work it can do in communities would really help here, I think. And Kylie mentioned at the beginning that one of my roles is as a member of the Approvals Committee of the New South Wales Heritage Council. And having done this work, I now approach that sort of approvals work very differently. And if we're looking at an application for change to a heritage place, I'm now asking myself questions like, what will people's experience of this place be once this work is done? And will that work or that change disrupt or support people's ability to connect and to leverage all these sorts of benefits that we've been talking about today? It's also important, I think, to use approaches that allow for public agency in the creation of heritage and heritage value and give space to people's imaginative and emotional experiences of heritage places, and accept that sometimes people's responses won't necessarily be embedded in historic facts, but will respond to the place in more creative ways, and that is perfectly okay. Within this framework of understanding, then, heritage interpretation becomes an important support to the work of heritage to enrich and energise relationships between people and the past in the present, and to help people go on this emotional and playful time-travelling journey. And these sorts of relationships between people and place are also important to understand, I think, and I've mentioned before, in the way new design contexts are created for archaeological remains or other elements of the historic environment, so that they inform the design and it can support rather than disrupt experiences and attachments. It also becomes important to consider keeping not just the big ticket items that meet the highest thresholds of significance, but also some local places for local people, because I think it's these daily interactions that can be the most enriching. As I've already said, having the materiality of heritage available for public access is also key. And as I mentioned earlier, my research alongside the work of others such as Rebecca Madgen, Sian Jones, Tracy Ireland, Jeremy Wells and Rodney Harrison suggests that the alchemy is in the interactions of people and the materiality of heritage places. So if you remove or rebury the archaeological remains, or significantly impact or destroy the historic building or the cultural landscape, you've severed that direct connection. You sever the ongoing creative capacity of the place and the opportunity for people to make and remake meanings, to find a moment of physical and mental respite, or in the words of one of the students at the Conservatorium of Music, you just stuff up the vibe. And as I've already mentioned, having some sites in situ allows future communities to choose their own responses to the archaeology, instead of the meaning of the site being fixed by the archaeological experts at the time of the excavation. The materiality of the past is then still available for future generations to make their own choices and find their own meanings. This is the reason I think that interpretation generally doesn't work as a mitigation measure for the loss of heritage value, something that, at least in Australia, is often recommended by consultants or required by consent authorities as some form of offset for the loss of heritage or heritage value. And while interpretation can support people's relationship with heritage places, it's hard to see, when you understand the way these relationships work, that it can act as a surrogate for the real thing. And I certainly am not against post-impact interpretation work of putting up a sign or doing a publication, or even a lot of this online virtual reality interpretation that we're now seeing. But I think we need to be very careful as an industry in our expectations and understandings of what that can actually do and achieve. This is also the reason why I now have a more relaxed attitude to the materials conservation approach that tends to drive decisions to rebury rather than provide public access to archaeological remains if they're going to be kept rather than destroyed. And I now ask myself, who is it being reburied for, and what is the likelihood anyone will ever have the energy and funds to go back and uncover it in the future, given we seem to struggle to find resources for many heritage places in the present? And I think on many sites, tolerating some physical impacts to the remains is worth serious consideration in the light of the significant public benefits that can arise from them being visible and accessible. I'm certainly not suggesting that everything needs to be kept everywhere. And in fact, I found there isn't public appetite for this to happen in Australia. Sometimes impacts are unavoidable or even desirable, and the old needs to make way for the new. Sometimes the conditions and context for keeping a site won't make for a good public experience, but retaining archaeological remains, keeping heritage places of all kinds, and ensuring they remain present and available to people in their everyday lives is worth the effort, time, and expense. The benefits, I think, far outweigh any issues that might arise in the process, because the abiding relationships that people build with these places sustain them through all the seasons of their lives. Spending time with the public at these 5 case study sites has deeply challenged my own understanding of archaeology and the work that it does in communities and the work that heritage does in communities. And in turn, this has changed me as a heritage practitioner and archaeologist. Not only did I find widespread support for retaining these remains and making them accessible, I found very deep connections to these places. And as I've said, it became clear they can deliver far more than information about the past. They can be widely valued in the present as a source of identity, belonging, connection, well-being, and resilience. And looking at archaeological places and heritage places more broadly through this lens, their future possibilities as a force to improve people's lives is vastly expanded. And I wanted to leave you with this quote from Professor Tracy Ireland when I interviewed her for this research, and I'll read it from the screen. She said, once you start doing a bit of research like this about how people react to and love archaeological remains and what they can do and the social life that the ruins can go on to have, then maybe that means we might do archaeology for a different reason. If we set up a project to address a social issue, like here you've got a place that's dangerous or not very nice that people don't linger in, and we've got some archaeology, how might we display it to address that social problem? That could be an interesting thought experiment. Well, thank you so much for joining me this morning, this evening, wherever you happen to be. I'd love to chat with you further if there are any questions, and you can always contact me at the email address here on the screen to further the conversation. And once again, thank you so much. And thank you also to the Global Alliance for Heritage Interpretation for including me in this webinar series.
Thanks, Caitlin. That was a fantastic presentation, and everybody is saying as much in the chat. So well done, and thank you. Big round of applause virtually. So I think we're a bit out of time in terms of doing Q&A at the moment. What I was going to say is if anybody wants to send questions through, they can either send them to Caitlin or send them to me at Interpretation Australia or through the GAHI website, and we'll be able to address any of those at this point. So at this point, I will hand back over to Chuck and say thank you very much, Caitlin. Very much appreciated, and thank you everybody for attending. Back to you, Chuck.
Thank you, Caitlin, for a fascinating presentation. That was very exciting to see some new ideas and think of archaeologists as interpreters. Thank you everyone for coming today. I want to thank Interpretation Australia and our speaker, Dr. Caitlin Allen. We hope you gained a new understanding of interpretation and archaeology in Australia. Please see our website for future webinars coming up. Our website is gahi.online. And just a reminder that interpretation is a seed, not a tree. So we planted more seeds today. Thanks everyone for coming.